Do 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 do. Okay, this is me being happy that I actually accomplished most of the requirements for Milestone 5 during weeks 2 and 3. So, to start off, volume control. The volumes control use audio mixer. I actually just built them straight into Game Manager, so we're just going to go ahead and take a peek at that real quick. Or, no, not Game Manager. Uh, the Audio Manager. So we'll just pop up an Audio Manager really quick in order to see those. So we have the master volume, the music volume, and the sound effects volume. And I didn't add in any of the Doppler effect or the mixer effects. I'm just doing it directly programmatically for the multipliers. And this was just so that I would be able to assure that all my sounds were working. Definitely not something that I'd use for a final build, especially if I'm supposed to be more aware of where everything is. But I can go ahead and explain what I would do for like a real serious game build. And rather than using the statics that go off of the base instance of the audio manager, I would instead use the mixer in order to do like the Doppler and the echo chamber and the distance justification kind of effects. But because right now with this solution, it doesn't matter where in with this current solution, everything has an equal volume and doesn't experience the same kind of geometric fallout that it would with a mixer. Because with the mixer would tune it so that the further away from, and I'll go over here real quick to show it, since the player chase camera is the one where I actually have the audio listener enabled. The main camera is the one that has the audio listener. So if I was going to do the distance fall off or the Doppler effects, it would affect how loud something is comparatively for the audio listener depending on the distance from the audio listener that it is. Another thing that you could do for the audio listener is you could remove it from the camera and put it on your player agent, but that would be kind of bizarre because you wouldn't be able to spawn more than one. And then the other issue would be that because I destroy my player agent, when the player agent is killed and it despawns the game object before the update loop recreates the player, I would actually lose the audio listener entirely. So in between point A and point B, you'd actually be deaf. So I left the audio listener on the camera like it's supposed to be, and I haven't really messed with the mixers in a fashion that would have audio fall off. So regardless of where something is in the scene in relation to the camera, it's always going to have the same volume, irregardless of distance or the direction that it's moving in comparison with the camera. As you can see here through the notice, the thing that I did right before I filmed this was I actually built it. So this is the final form of the game. Audio triggered. So yeah, I already have I've had this since pretty much the middle of week 2. And what this does for me is it lets me spawn sounds at a given location, and it lets me spawn the music. For the music, my ambient is just like a running wind track, so I can play it, but you've probably heard it previously in the earlier editions of the game, so I'm not going to make you sit here and listen to something that showed up in pretty much every milestone since the third one. Yeah, but it's really just a background noise. And you can see here that it's not on the audio manager itself. It's actually assigned through the game manager. You can see the scenes list that I'm just leaving empty for the sake of it. But the scenes list is how you would move between the various scenes, and there's multiple ways to populate it. I mean, you can hard populate it through the inspector here, or you can use the logic for the game manager itself, for the game engine itself, to populate the list when it spawns. or populate the list when the game starts. And that would be done procedurally for the game, since we only have like 5 weeks to develop this. There really isn't much time to not only implement the procedural level generation, but also to implement the procedural level transitions. But yeah, there's that. So particle effects, you've seen those before. Lighting, you've seen those before. Run smoothly at 60 frames per second. You've seen that before. The build available, that'll actually be I actually had to push it to my Wix page because that was the only place that I could manage to successfully post the RAR, because the direct link libraries for it's actually too big for it to successfully post to GitHub. Fun. But I put the RAR for it up on my portfolio page, so it's there, it's built, it's out. So I'll just run through a quick playthrough for it so that you can see that everything is still working. Settings wise, I'll just go through and I'll show all the settings that I have on the UI manager. So you can see that it moves, that it shoots, you can see the sparks of it hitting things. You can see the fact that when I run over the health pickup and my health is already 100%, I don't pick it up. And you can see that I have the health bar, that the icon changes. Another quick display of the lighting. Since I have the lighting probe set to additive, you can actually see the offset down there, both for the gun and for the player. And you can see the offset shadow for the bad guy. And if I angle it right, you can see the additive nature of this light focus with its flickering, which I kind of thought was a cool way to implement. And you can also see how when the light casts on the enemy, they actually light up. And that had a lot to do with the vectors. You can see, since I'm using the additive nature, you can see the way that when I cast the shadow, it compounds onto it. One of the interesting things that I had to address was the fact, since I'm using the additive shadow nature, or the additive light nature, that you'll see 2 to 3 or 4 different sources of light on it. So there's a directional light that's lighting up the entire scene. There's spotlights, which are these green ones here, which are lighting up a given area. And then you have the well, okay, I take that back. These are spotlights. What's attached to this, no, these are point lights. What's attached to the rifle here is a spotlight, and then what's over here on these are actually area lights. And you can see the difference in the additive nature for them because of the parallels that they run between the lights themselves and the characters, causes different types of shadows to show up. So like with this one, you can see the shadow that's that it's getting from the directional light. Then you can see the shadow that it's getting from the spotlight, and you can tell the different types of casting due to the drawing layers that it's on. Got him. And you can see the pickups still work. I'll go ahead and pop them another couple times, just so you can see the variety of the spawns. So you can see with the weighted spawn that it's actually generated it on drop, so that gives me different utility in the code than if I was having them choose what they're going to drop when they spawn, which is another way of doing it, but I wouldn't necessarily do it when I only have like 2 or 3 dozen mobs. And as you could see earlier, the the way that the enemy agent was following me around and navigating around obstacles, the AI is very much intact and functional, seen as how it can navigate around the various obstacles in order to keep chasing the player. So, yeah, that shows pretty much everything that's involved with it. I've had the sound triggers, the audio, the environmental, the particle effects for a pretty long time. It runs really smooth, and that's largely thanks to the fact that because I'm using more detailed shadows and lighting, and when I am using the lighting, I'll pop open the rifle real quick here so that you can see the settings that I have on the flashlight. So as you can see with the shadows, it actually I have it set up to be custom, and that's just because when you're dealing with the spotlights and everything else, you have to be considerate of what kind of intensity and everything else that you're dealing with when it comes to the illumination. It's saying right here that real-time indirect bouncing shadowing is not supported for spot and point lights, which, since this is a spotlight, of course it doesn't have the indirect shadow or the indirect lighting. And indirect bounce shadowing doesn't apply, but that's okay. It's nice to have the flashlight for it because of the different effects and kind of ambiance that it provides for the games. Having volumetric fog and having spotlights for this would make like a horror survival game much more realistic and immersive. So it's really good to have various other options. And like right here, I have cone, because a cone is what you get with the spotlight. But there could be other things that you do with the ambiance. And now I'll go ahead and show you one of the area lights that I have here. So this one's an area light, and I think... Ew. Is that right? Yeah, that's right. And this one's also going to be an area light. It's just going to be in a different color. So then what you see with the lighting for this is that you have the various settings for the lighting and its range and its intensity multiplier, and a lot of this is affected by the auto dimming, auto brightness kind of function that you get, which I remember quite clearly was kind of put forward by Valve in their Lost Coast, where they started to experiment with adjusting light opacity, and it eventually made its way into the graphics rendering pipelines in general, which is kind of cool. And I mean, earlier when I was playing with games before I turned down the directional light like this, if it was really bright out here and you went into the shadow, it auto dims, which is really cool, and it's part of the high definition rendering pipeline. I'll go ahead and actually turn this up and show it real quick, just because I think this feature of auto rendering is really kick-ass. As you can see, you can just barely still see the spotlight when it casts a shadow off of something else. And watch, as I transition from the bright area out here into the shadow down here, it'll actually... Yeah. Well, as you can see from that, my enemy can still hunt me down. Can obviously still hunt me down with a machine gun. So, yeah, the AI still is working quite well. I just have the impact sounds for the player still turned off because I just constantly get sick of hearing him, and I've grown completely, incomparably, vexated by the sound of the player getting hit when I was doing all the testing for the HP and everything else. Um, but yeah, that pretty much covers everything, because everything I had before in the previous exercises still exists. It hasn't actually changed all that much from Milestone 4. The pause menu still works. I'll just go ahead and show that, and I'll stop the game before. See, so the pause menu still works, and everything else is still implemented. It's just I'm getting kind of tired of looking at it. I need to. Frankly, I'd want to redo the entire thing all over again from scratch if I was going to do it, because there's a lot of tricks and hints and things that I saw along the way while I was developing this that'd be like, oh, that'd be really cool to implement, but and it's like, but there's like no place for it in the current project catalog, and it'd probably take me like 2 weeks to do that, and then yeah, it's kind of frustrating. I mean, even as a database developer, I ran into these kind of problems where I'd be working on a project, then I learned a new way of organizing the data structure, or I'd learn a new way of implementing or executing some kind of task, but I'd already be in the middle of the project, and it's like, yeah, I really kind of want to do this again, but or I really want to add this kind of like feature or ability to this, but then it's like, well, that's well beyond the scope of the current project, and the amount of time that it would take to implement would put me well beyond the deadline. So yeah, it's cool to kind of be able to marvel at it and be like, oh, it's so awesome, but being able to actually turn around and implement some of the stuff just isn't feasible in the time frame. So it's a little bit vexing, but it's still pretty cool. Learning all this stuff and getting everything else working. Yeah, but that's pretty much it. I didn't do too terribly much with the with everything else for the player camera. And most of that is just setting it so that it automatically scales to the screen. So there isn't too terribly much you can do to screw that up. You just have to make certain that you have everything set up properly for it. And I mean, you'll never see it, but I included a skybox. Because this is a top-down game, there's no real reason for the skybox except for reflection mapping on cube maps, but I didn't implement any of that stuff. So the only thing that I do that makes the game seem smoother, even though it's kind of making stuff look a little funny, or it's making the shadows smoother, so even with the game not currently in play mode right here, you can actually see the shadows that it's projecting. And because I have a the fast approximation anti-aliasing, you can actually see that the shadows themselves get smoothed out, even though the objects that they're coming off of are very simple primitives. It makes for a real nice feature when it comes to smoothing the shadows. So that's one of the additional things that I did for this one. For the game engine was the fact that my light sources are additive. Somewhere. Real-time shadows, ultra, yeah. So all the settings for the shadows and everything else are actually turned up pretty high, which can be really processor intensive, but I'm running this on a Intel i9 8-core of the 9th generation with a 720 Super, or a 2070 Super, I transposed that, RTX, and 32 gigabytes of RAM, so my computer can definitely handle just like the 100 or so shadows that the map has to do with. So that is definitely important to note, because some of the older systems are definitely going to choke on having the anti-aliasing being a part of it. But navigation-wise, it's not that hard. For equipment-wise, I'm still above and beyond the pall for that because the enemies are actually required to seek out their own weapon and pick it up, which makes it feel a bit more immersive for me. Because when the bad guy is having to look for a gun just as much as I do, it adds another vector of gameplay. Because now, not only am I trying to beat the enemy by shooting them, but I'm also trying to get to the gun before they do, in order to be able to shoot them. So, it made life interesting. It definitely made life interesting for development because of all the additional code that had to go into consideration for enabling the enemies to pick it up, which ended up requiring a lot of nested Boolean statements on humanoid pawn. Well, no, humanoid pawn's very straight up and down. The one that it's weapons class that everything had to go on that differentiates all the script, and that's just all on the colliders here. So as you can see here, in order to let the player and the bad guy both pick up the same gun, there actually has to be collision player tags in order for the container to work correctly, or for the collision to function properly. And then there had to be additional script for when the bad guy picked it up so that it wouldn't override the player container and the ammo display on the screen. Since they both use the same base class, I actually have to disable the ammunition update for the text screen for the ammo count, because otherwise if the enemy starts firing, it would overwrite the players. That was a bit gnarly to figure out initially, but eventually I got around to it and everything else. I'm from a database background, so enumerators are a huge thing for me, and I feel much more comfortable using enumerators for finite designations than I do just passing a public variable or using a get statement. Even though this is a get statement here, when I'm looking at this programmatically, I can see, okay, where does this enumerator come from? Okay, it comes from the weapon class. Which enumerator is it? Okay, it's weapon name. Okay, now what enumerator am I looking at? I'm looking at blaster. So for me, as a programmer who knows how to write later supportable code for other programmers, even if my variable names are sometimes questionable, I know that using enumerators when I'm specifically dealing with finite states in another class is a lot more developer friendly than, and it shows up in the inspector too, so it's a lot more friendly to the designers when I use enumerations rather than just using hard-coded numbers or the fantastic hard-coded mystery numbers, which I've seen in some of the gnarlier code sets. But yeah, so this particular block of code here that I'm using the enumerators for is to change the graphics that is attached to the player UI, which shows the player which type of weapon they currently have equipped as part of the UI. It's really straightforward. So it checks to see if what the current assigned variable for the equipped weapon class is against the enumeration basis, and it checks to see if it has any of the two assigned. And then if it doesn't, then it nulls the sprite, and then if the sprite itself is null, then it doesn't render the graphics box, because if it did render the graphics box, it would be a blank semi-transparent blue box, which gums up the UI and is a bit obnoxious. And originally I could have just used the straight sprite itself and left no color for the graphics UI, but doing that would, how should I put it, having no sprite for it, or having no filter, because I basically end up using, let's just pop back over, instead of talking about it, Oh, it's not under that. It's under the camera. Camera. So there's the ammo counter. It's this smaller box up in here. And one of the things that I kind of wanted to try out was the shifting and the fuzzing of the display when the player got hit, but I just didn't really feel comfortable expending that kind of time to implement what is really just a gimmick. So as you can see here, I actually have a color set for the box itself. And when the source image is null, when the sprite that it's supposed to be displaying is null, it will actually disable this so it doesn't show up. And then here's the pause menu and the game over menus, which are disabled at the startup and enable during the pause. The thing that you're not seeing is that it will spawn a pause menu when the pause button is hit. And the way that that is set up is that this thing right here will spawn. And it's a transparent backdrop so that when the menu is spawned, it obstructs the view of the game field when the game's paused so that you can focus more on the foreground. And it actually instantiates an existence of it from the prefabs folder every time you hit the pause button, then destroys it when you get rid of it. And I've noticed that there's a lot of pause transitions in some of the games, and this pause backdrop for me helps provide the player with yet another visual cue that the game is paused. So I feel it's a helpful visual indicator, and because of that I feel that it's a necessary feature rather than just popping up a pause menu and everything not moving in the background. It could also help balance the game, because if you gray out the area around, people can't use it like a poor man's use the pause menu like a poor man's bullet time. Okay, hit pause. This guy's over there. This guy's over there. That guy's over there. I'm gonna turn, shoot that guy, then that one, then that one, then that one. So I feel like it's better to have the pause menu obscure the background so that players don't use it as a crutch. But other than that, everything is working pretty much the same way that it was working before. I'm still using NavMesh, which I demonstrated in great depth by wandering all over the map while the unarmed mob was chasing my player. So the NavMesh agent is fully capable of navigating. There's even off-grid locations. So if I wanted to grief the enemy agent into using one of these off-mesh nav points, I would put like the gun up here, or I put it up here, and then you'd be able to see them hop off or drop down. But I just use the instead of doing more complex things with the nav mesh agent, I intend to just take time and fool around with that later as part of self-induced exercises with the Unity engine, or as part of the studio. I went ahead and I built a complete finite state machine for the enemy AI, which makes my enemy agent act in a far more robust manner than if I was just using some simple Boolean logic statements. So everything I have actually uses the Boolean logic, and I kind of went with Shy Guy code, which was interesting, because when we get down to the shoot at player, found player, reach for gun, reach for health, chase player, make movement, shoot at player. So when we get down to here, the player's current distance actually has to be a certain value away from the enemy agent, otherwise the enemy agent won't fire. And the main reason I did this is because with the way that I set up the bullets so that they're all ouch pickups, they're all pickup types actually, they're all ouch pickups, this type, it collides with everybody. So if I have the player standing in the middle of the crowd of a bunch of enemy AIs that are firing bullets that hurt everybody on the screen that they hit. If the player is really close to a bunch of AI agents, they'll shoot each other. So the reason that in the AI controller here that I went and said it has to be greater than the stopping distance for the pawn director is so that the player can't just run through a crowd of enemy AI and let them shoot each other. Like, they can still do it from distance, but they can't just like cluster together and take each other out for the player. And the main reason I did that is because one of the games I was playing recently, Ruiner, which is a top-down shooter as well. Shooter / melee combo / brawler, bang bang, shoot 'em up, is that the enemy agents are capable of shooting each other and of taking each other out. And that was kind of a cool feature because I kind of like the consideration that a bullet's a bullet. And it doesn't care who fired the gun and who their friends are. A bullet's a bullet. So it adds an additional layer of interaction in the world for the bullets to be able to hurt everybody, irregardless of who originally shot them. Because to me that feels more realistic on the ballistic considerations than the magical phase through friendly identify friend or foe bullets that you see in so many of the old arcade and even some of the current titles. I understand that people don't like the concept of friendly fire, especially in multiplayer online cooperative, because it gets in the way of entertainment, but I like the fact that if a bullet's a bullet, it adds a different kind of layer of consideration for it. And in a game like this, I deliberately put in the don't shoot if they're too close to you function into the game to prevent the AIs from readily taking out each other when a player's too close. And that was just to keep things challenging for the player, rather than make things more gamey by making it so that the players, that the bullets fired by the enemies don't collide with the enemies. I made it so that the bullets fired by anybody collide with everybody. And the only nod that I have to it is under the bullet move script, I actually make it so that the collider for it is not active for the first little bit that it exists. So right here, this bit of code. So this is what's actually moving it, and then the activation is actually enabling the capsule for the bullet to hit somebody, because otherwise it would hit the person that shot it, especially after the addition of the ragdoll colliders or other things. So giving it that little itty bitty brief tenth of a second of not being enabled means that irregardless of who's shooting the rifle, since they're both shooting the exact same identical rifle with the exact same identical bullets, that the player and the opponent don't end up hitting themselves when they're shooting, which could be a problem. Kind of funny problem, but it can still be a problem if you don't do that. And the main reason I did that is because, say, later on I wanted to have bouncing projectiles or some reflecting projectiles. I want the players to take a deeper consideration on where and when they're shooting, and not just like spray and pray. And the main reason I wanted to do that is because I think increasing the difficulty of doing damage to the opponent while also not doing damage to yourself builds into the mechanics of the gameplay, which make it a more entertaining experience than just randomly walking around spraying bullets everywhere to hit the opponent. I also think that putting the engagement limit on the AI makes it harder for the players to get the opponents to shoot each other, simply by disabling the just shoot at will kind of logic that they use. But yeah, that pretty much covers the code and most of the things that are unique to the game. Um, Other than that, mine is pretty straight up and forward. The only other thing that I can really talk about is project settings. Project settings. The physics here. So if we go down to the for physics, no. Lighting. It's under lighting, I think. Yep, I think it's graphics or HDRP settings. So, for most of my classmates watching this, this is going to be complete gibberish because most of you didn't use the high definition rendering pipeline. Light layer names, I didn't change any of that. Decal layers, didn't change any of that. Oh, here it is. So you can actually see that you can adjust your light settings for everything else. These are what I turned up in order to be able to do the multiple depth or the multiple pass for the lighting in order to get everything working right. And then for time there was even the lighting manager. And here's all the shaders that are included as part of this. This is why the build for this game, even as small as it is already 380 megabytes. I will say that I did have other levels built, but the levels were actually more complex than this one, and it pushed the build size over a point where in which I could even post it on Wix. So for the final build, I only included the one level with all of the scripts and everything that backs it up, because otherwise I would have had a hard time being able to publish it for free, which would have been a significant challenge. As it is, with the even just the size of the direct link libraries, I couldn't even push it to GitHub because the direct link library size itself alone was too big to fit on GitHub. Fun. But other than that, that's pretty much everything. The settings menu got pared down to being pretty much just the game manager, the UI manager, the audio manager, somewhere. Where did I put that? Yeah, there it is. The audio manager, the event system. Mainly because size constraints. In order to be able to publish it and build it for free on the websites, I had to actually cut down the game build, because otherwise it wouldn't fit, which was kind of upsetting, but tomato tomato. The game looks pretty. The graphics look real nice. The lighting adds a ton of ambiance, and it's kind of interesting because I was playing like Grim Dawn the other day, and I realized how many types of things that were in Grim Dawn that I just literally did myself with this title, including fun fact, Grim Dawn, just like this project, the enemy agents don't use raycasts in order to see the player. So if the player is within X distance of them and they've already triggered like a hear or attacked near me kind of script, the enemies can actually see them through the walls, which is kind of cool. But it's a bit broken because they'll try to shoot through the walls as well. And that's something that I really didn't include in this build, is I didn't include the raycast for the enemy to be able to see if they can actually quote-unquote see the player. But the game itself still worked, so no lost water. It's just that if I was actually going to do an honest-to-goodness top-down shooter with realistic mechanics and everything else, I would include raycasts, and then I could improve on the mesh logic by making it iterate up the movement tree, because with the nav mesh agents, apparently according to the documentation that the nav mesh agents provide, you can actually check the logic off of the basis of where they're moving, and you can even spawn a temporary empty or prefab that you have and do raycast from that prefab to see if that location that it's going to move to is going to be able to see the player, and then you can do recalculations on the logic based off of that. So for some people that's going to sound like Greek. You can look at where the agent wants to go and then check the lines of sight from where that agent is at that point in traversal to see if it can see the player from there. And then based off whatever logic or coding that you have at that point, you can go ahead and determine if you should switch the AI state from moving to shooting at that point. But since this is just a very straightforward 5-week introductory to elements of gameplay, or elements of the development of gameplay, I just stuck with, okay, is he this far from you? Do you have a gun? Okay, go ahead and try to shoot him. If he's too close, stop shooting. That, at the end of the day, that is all this project contains. Okay, so default lookup. High definition rendering pipeline gives me all kinds of bizarre little knocks and nodges when it comes to development. But it makes it look real pretty. And sometimes graphics sell games. But, yep, aside from that, that's my project. Thank you for your time.